This podcast was produced by OAR FM Dunedin with support from New Zealand On Air.
This episode of Rewilding in Action was first aired on the 12th of December 2024.
The success of river restoration programs is driven by the flood history. You need the floods to activate the river to make the restoration project successful.
Kia ora. Welcome to Rewilding in Action with me, your host, Maureen Howard. For this episode, I'm in the OAR FM studio and I have river scientist Professor Gary Brierley from the University of Auckland on the end of the line to chat with me about rewilding rivers and streams. Gary is Professor and Chair of Physical Geography and within the School of Environment. And today we'll be talking about why river rewilding is a good idea and how we can go about doing it, or at least getting there part way. So welcome to the show, Gary.
Kia ora, Maureen. It's wonderful to be here.
It's really great to have you on the end of the line. And so last episode, just to put you in the picture, Gary, last episode I visited with Janice Lord out at her property at Currybush, which is just south of Dunedin. And she's got some nice regenerating forest there. And she also has a stream that runs down through the property. And we were admiring the rewilding that was happening there after the October flood. And so I thought it would be a really great opportunity to link in that episode with having my next one be about rewilding rivers and streams. And so I did a little bit of a search, and you popped up as a river scientist who's, passionate about restoring rivers. And I really appreciated some of the stuff that you'd written. In particular, you had this piece in The Conversation 2021 that you'd done with your colleagues. And I'll just read the title here because it's Why We Should Release New Zealand's Strangled Rivers to Lessen the Impact of Future Floods. So, you graduated in 1989 as a physical geographer, but you've come in here to write this article. Why did you write that? Because it's, for something that you're really putting out there to the public.
Yeah, it's a great question. What motivates us to do what we do, and how do we go about doing these things? I'm just going to backtrack just 1 second to your introduction. I mean, I think that rivers are products of their landscapes. They're products of their catchments. So the forests and the streams are all part and parcel of the same thing, right? And so I think that we can't manage one without looking after the other. It's a holistic lens is definitely the way that we've got to start conceptualizing these things and thinking what is possible. And you're right. It was a passion to make use of the science that I'd started with. The kind of science that I'd done was a mix of geomorphology, landscape science, and sedimentology, the sediments that are laid down and how that can inform interpretations of past environments. And I made a decision after I moved from my PhD in Canada to working at Australian National University that I wanted to work in the applied field, right? Work in the applied domain. And so that started in the early 1990s. And I've carried on in that space. And the motivation for the work that I do is very place-based. It's very catchment-specific. I developed a framework with colleagues from Australia on how to look after the place-based values of river systems. And a large part of that is working out what is possible where, what is realistically achievable in the ways of looking after river systems. And the Strangled Rivers work was done with a large team of collaborators. We really went across different institutions, people with different backgrounds, to try to show that people from a wide range of fields have a similar sense of understanding of the injustice that we're doing to our rivers and in the ways of looking after them. We're manufacturing future disasters. We know enough about the ways that rivers work and the ways that they need their space, that if we take that space off them, we concentrate the energy of those rivers. And this has profound implications for future society. This is the geographer in me coming through now. They're profound implications for social and environmental justice because we burden future generations. If we don't look after rivers now, we're creating problems that we're expecting our children and grandchildren to look after.
And do you think it's because perhaps we haven't defined what a river is properly? We talk about a river ecosystem and you tend to think, right, well, obviously you've got the water and you've got the creatures that live in it, you've got the banks and the base, but what else is a river that's beyond that?
I've got two sides to the answer to that in a way. One is going back to the forests and the rivers, the landscape and the rivers, and seeing rivers as products of the land over which they flow. But the other is the ways in which we have developed frameworks here in Aotearoa for looking after our rivers. The legal lens, that we've had immense difficulties in how we define a river and what the expectations of those rivers will be. And there's a lovely piece that was written called The Land the Law Forgot, coming out of Christchurch, out of University of Canterbury. And again, a group of individuals followed up on that work to say that the way that we perceive a river, the conceptualization of a river, represents perspectives from the mother country, when that mother country being the UK, England, where there the notion of glaciated landscapes with big, active, braided rivers was a mystery. They had no sense of what those things, how those systems worked and their distinctive characteristics and attributes. Yet here in Aotearoa, particularly on the South Island and other parts of the North Island as well, they're the characteristic, iconic rivers that we need to look after, that we're a part of. And we don't even have the legal lens right for defining what the bed and the bank of a river is. And when you don't have that right, you don't have any ability or capacity to look at relationships between the channel and the floodplain and how a multi-channeled, active, dynamic river system works.
The river itself, it's more than just the banks and the base. It's that whole floodplain area too, because as you're saying, it's a dynamic thing. The
catchment-based perspective, I think we make that perspective, that understanding of looking at rivers as the veins on a leaf. But for more than 100 years, we've actually said, but the river is the whole leaf. It's all of the land that feeds into the river, because rivers as interconnected, indivisible entities, what happens upstream impacts downstream. What happens on channels is related to what happens on floodplains. And the thing that's often overlooked that in rivers is so critical to ecosystems is surface water, groundwater interactions and the fundamental importance of the bugs and beasties that live beneath river systems that fashion the way that food webs work. But if we don't adopt a holistic lens, if we don't think of the function of the entire system, then we're deluding ourselves, right? Because we know that that's how the system works. We know that these connections play out. And we know the legacy effects of what went before and how that shapes what's possible into the future. So we know what the responses to forest clearance was centuries past and how the rivers now are transporting sediments in different ways to what they used to be. So the rivers themselves behave in different ways now relative to the past, but we'll never be able to look after them properly unless we adopt a catchment framed big picture perspective. That's one of those sort of universal truths. You can't look after the river unless you apply that lens.
Right. So that's, I guess, would require a lot of cooperation because obviously that land is owned by a lot of different people, isn't it?
And that's the catch-22 in all of these things, right? I mean, it really is the ownership and the sense of boundaries and the sense of something that's locked in place for a system that simply isn't. All landscapes change. They always evolve. They always adjust. And I think that my favorite word of the moment is emergent, right? All systems are emergent and they adjust in ways that we cannot necessarily predict. And so we've got to learn to live with that and develop frameworks that are aligned with that way of thinking. So if we carry on with these locked in approaches, then we know what the consequences will be. And we will be burdening future generations with the costs of recovery or cleanup. Somewhere along the way, there has to be a shift in thinking in our relationship to the land and our relationship to rivers.
Right. So obviously, if we think we're very fortunate here in Aotearoa, we've got our Māori worldview, Te Ao Māori view of looking at nature. And obviously the river's very, very important to Māori. So is that perhaps an avenue that you would see that we could follow to make this shift?
Yeah, fundamentally. And I'd say, why isn't that the lens that we're adopting and following? Because everybody is harmed by unhealthy relationships to rivers. And we have golden opportunities here to adopt something that a lens, a framework that is there and in front of us, where principles are very, very clear. They're very well expressed, articulated. They're very understood. They underpin things like the rights of the river discussion and debate, where if you look at Te Mano Te Wai or Te Ao Māori sort of principles and lens, they align directly with where principles of Western science are taking us, right? There's a distinct point of convergence there. So there is hope in the prospect that that can work, but we all know how contested those relationships are and how coming back to land and boundaries that are associated with it, that's the challenge that we have is how we work together, and a different way of conceptualizing these things is required if we're going to get there.
You also talked about in something I read, is it Medean and Gaian? Yeah. Medean being a competitive view and Gaian being cooperative. Could you talk a little bit more about that?
It's borrowed, right? This whole notion is borrowed from Tim Flannery, right? And a lot of the work that he did now quite a long time ago, a couple of decades ago. And it's very much the sort of sense of how are we living with our world? If you look, for example, I'm going to step back just a second again here. I don't even particularly like the word river management, right? Because to me, management implies asserting human authority over a river. Whereas I want to live generatively with a living river. That's my ethos. That's where I'm coming from, right? So that's my particular mindset, right? The way in which I approach these things. And that is a Gaian lens. It's one that is shaped by a holistic, collective view of we're all in this together. We're all on the same waka. And I think about the ways the institutional arrangements work and the ways that even departments at universities work and the ways that funding models work, where we have competition between ecologists and geomorphologists and hydrologists. And rather than actually working together and all being part of the same team, the models that we're working at are actually helping us to pull things apart. And we set up programs that are not holistically framed. They're framed on component parts rather than seeing the big picture of the relationships, which ultimately drives how the system works. So we are doing a really good job with small bits, but in ways that are in competition with what's happening elsewhere within that system. And so unless we have a way of pulling all of those threads together, it's not going to work in an effective way. And again, in terms of how we go about thinking about how a Gaian world may work, I love the word threads, just like in a braided river, a characteristic of the South Island, so many South Island systems. There's a lovely piece of work on braided knowledges for braided rivers, how we interweave different strands of knowledge, multiple knowledge lens, whatever that word you want to use for it, to work out what's best for the river itself. This can be as hard or as complicated or as simple as you want it to be. And again, it's very simplistic, but from my lens right now, I say, if it harms the river, why do it? Why?
Yeah.
And if we have a river-centric or an eco-centric lens, something that puts the rights of the river front and center, can't that be a platform for negotiation, for discussion about better ways for us moving forward? And for a long time, I've played on this notion of healthy rivers are products of healthy societies and vice versa. And so if your river's in a mess, it says something about the way you're living with it.
Yes. And we have channelized, some of the very worst examples. We've turned rivers into drains with concrete edges to them.
And the loss of wetlands and the functionality of these systems has been utterly transformed. And of course it makes sense, and of course we have to today work with the world as it is. not some fanciful notion of the world as it was. And so everything that we do from here has to be appropriately grounded and realistic. And in the work that we did from Strangled Rivers, and some of the follow-up work that we did, we adopted kind of like a traffic light scheme, which says, if your river is completely constrained in the middle of a city or it's piped underneath Queen Street, you're not going to change that in a flash, right? It's going to be virtually impossible to adapt those situations. Rivers in Fiordland, hopefully we realize that those rivers are in pretty good nick and we're going to leave them in good nick, right? We're going to, they're the green traffic light situations. And there are many of them across Aotearoa as well. And it's the yellow traffic light situations, the stop-go type situations, working out what we can do at those situations that are somewhere in between, that are highly contested and highly politically challenging. Personally, I see looking after the river so that it looks after us is a very healthy platform for doing that kind of work. I don't like words that take us backwards or conceptualize something as backwards. So restoration or rehabilitation
or rewilding
or rewilding, right? Because I think that you have to do what you can with the situation that you've got, right? And I'm really trying to promote a much more forward-thinking, proactive and strategic approach, which is shaped by what's gone before, but genuinely embraces what's coming, right? And is realistically framed in relation to what that could look like.
Yes. Well, if we're to bring it back to, steps we might take, in rewilding, obviously in the Northern Hemisphere, they reintroduce beavers and things like that. So we're not doing that. So what kind of steps, can we take, let's say, if, for the individual in a practical way, if you've got a stream or on your property?
I think that at an individual level, wherever you can safely give space for your river and let it adjust and let it do its own thing and reduce the fixed boundaries along your river. Rivers need space. They're adjusted to having space and they use that space very efficiently. And when you do rewild a stream, what the river does is it starts to use its energy in a different way. Things like wood or riparian vegetation, or in Northern Hemisphere, beaver in rivers, they create roughness elements on the valley's floor. And those, when flow goes over and around those roughness elements, the river is using its own energy in friction to get around those features. So the river starts to use its energy in different ways when it has more roughness. Canals are very, very smooth. Their boundaries are very, very smooth. So the frictional loss is much, much less. So from an individual perspective, if you can live with the river as a living system and allow it to adjust and use its own space, that's actually a good thing. And, rivers need floods to erode, and the sediment that we generate from erosion ends up on floodplains and creates healthy soils, right? So loss of sediment from one area or soil from one area creates healthy soils elsewhere in the system. And the success of river restoration programs is driven by the flood history. You need the floods to activate the river to make the restoration project successful.
This is what we find. So with my friend Janice, after the October flood, she has a stream, and it's a lovely little stream. But what it had brought down was this gravel, and she now had lovely clear water with gravel on the base, and she was very excited about the possibilities, of having little of kura. She was hoping that this would provide some good habitat for them. She's got galaxids. But as you say, these big flood events, although they can be very disturbing for us as humans because we've built our homes and our land close to the river, for the river itself, it's part of its really healthy functioning, isn't it?
It is. And to me, that is how you define a healthy river, right? You must look at a river in ways that include the flood regime as part of what that river does, right? Because that's what created and shaped that river. So when you think about river health or riverscape health, you include impacts of flood events. And you must look at, you don't look at post a flood and say, oh, that's a disaster, right? You look at it and go, that is the river that is adjusting and using its own energy. And depending upon your mindset, we are part of that process of adjustment. One of the bugbears of most people who do what I do is the word stability, and this sense that the environment is ever going to be stable or static, because it's a nonsense and we can't recreate stable systems. It's not the direction we should be thinking.
So what gives you hope, Gary, for the future? Like, do you see any kind of shift in how humans are thinking?
Space to move, rights of nature are global movements, right? And there's, these are deeply contextual situations, but they're happening everywhere. And there's been, a lot of interventions in different parts of the world, some of them going back several decades, of giving space back to rivers, and rivers reoccupying secondary channels, and buying up land in some parts of the world and by indigenous peoples, and then the rivers themselves and those that are given the land back. And so we move human activities off those low-lying surfaces and make them more temporary activities. There are space to move interventions in China and in the Philippines, as well as Europe and South America. So I think that definitely gives me hope. The realization is there. And of course, it takes very, very different forms in different circumstances, different contexts. In Northern Europe, in Netherlands and what have you, the space to move interventions are very, very engineered approaches to giving the river space in often densely populated landscapes. And so they need to be. But the reality is there. The sea level's going to do its thing and the climate's doing its thing. So the rivers will take that space, and the pre-existing infrastructure is not fit for purpose in those situations. So that's one prospect there. In a New Zealand context, I would love to see a situation where stock banks that aren't needed, inverted commas, can be taken out. Just like there's a global movement for taking dams out that are no longer fit for purpose, I think there's a large number of stock banks in this river, and a few come to my mind already immediately. I mean, I haven't had discussions with the landowners about this, right? But I can see that taking the stock banks out would actually have great chance to regenerate river systems where channels could connect to floodplains, where we could recreate multi-channel systems relatively easily. And the sense of loss in those situations would not be that great in cost-benefit terms. Right, so there's some kind of approach to manage retreat and payout system, maybe something that we have to envisage going forward. And again, globally, that fits in with big picture natural flood management programs, which have to be catchment scale, and we have to operationalize or start some of these buyback schemes way up in catchments to create flood storage spaces to reduce the downstream impacts of those floods. So that thinking, I think, is quite positive. It's clearly underway, and it's just a matter of how we apply those principles here in Aotearoa.
Yes, it is. And I think it's great that you're in this space and you've got a huge amount of experience, and that you're turning your understanding towards, helping Aotearoa move in this direction is really great. And so I understand that you're working on, you've got a number of things in the pipeline.
Yeah. I mean, I think that just reflecting very quickly on a couple of them and the spaces that I think are really interesting in how that work is shaping up. The Let the River Speak project that I have here with Anne Salmon and Dan Hikaroa and Billy Lithberg, colleagues at University of Auckland, is a really exciting sort of interaction on what does it take to put the interests of the river front and center, and how do we go about working towards that kind of goal. And I see, and this is underexplored, probably a little bit academic, but very interesting kind of work for me, is the relationships between the Maori lens on those kinds of let the river speak principles and the work we're doing in Western China on ecological civilization, which is through a Taoist lens. And I think principles of Wu Wei, let it be, standing back, leaving the system to itself, recognizing our role as part of these systems, is actually a very convergent space that, for over the world's longest continuous irrigation scheme is in Dujiangyan in Western China in Sichuan. And that's been operating for more than 2,000 years continuously, very large scale system. And it works with the river. And that premise, I think, is a very sound premise, a very sound way for us to be thinking about this kind of work going forward. So that's definitely a sign of hope.
Many thanks to my guest, Professor Gary Brierley, for sharing his knowledge and his wisdom. In summary then, healthy rivers are rivers that flood, and for that, they need space to move. And we can also help them dissipate their energy by restoring those roughness elements that rivers with rocky sides and pebbly bottoms have, which of course is also so important for biodiversity. And most of all, we need to change how we view rivers. They are dynamic entities within the landscape and not water channels for us to manage. So thank you for listening to Rewilding in Action. I'm Maureen Howard, and in the next episode, I'm off to the Otago Peninsula to scrabble after the SWAT team on one of their intrepid missions to remove banana passion fruit from a piece of regenerating bush. So a big question I have is, how does what SWAT do support the natural regeneration of native-dominated forest on the Otago Peninsula? So I hope you get to listen in to find out.
This podcast was produced by OAR FM Dunedin with support from New Zealand On the Air.